Hello, everyone, and welcome to On the Cutting Room Floor. And this is our podcast that we put together for talking about the message after the message, because so much gets left behind. If you're just hopping on here, take a moment right now and share. I'm going to do the same, sharing the video. Oh, it's on my feed. Who would I share it to? It's already on my feed. So you guys share it to your feeds, like the video and whatnot, so others will hop on with us. But we are excited to talk about last week, which was Luke 22. And I have in the room with me host Daniela. Why don't you say hi? There she is. You have to say
Well, good morning to everybody.
And we got Pastor Tim next to Daniela.
What's up, y'all? Thanks for tuning in.
I think I'm here. Good morning.
There he is. Now, if you are watching online, you can throw questions in here about Luke 22. For me, as the speaker, I think one thing that I realized at the end when the skit was going on, that was Charlie Brown did an amazing job with the skit.
Yeah, that was cool.
I was blown away by it. And it finally sort of connected in my brain. Oh, this is not a chapter with separate parts. This is a chapter that shares Peter's folly, if you want. A couple people, we don't know who they are exactly, but people jumping up saying silly things. I've got two swords. Another group, two guys fighting about which one's the best. I don't think they tell us who that was either. I have to go back and look. And then you get to the Judas's part. And when Charlie Brown, the guy who was doing the skit, when he sort of talked about Judas and realizing, man, he could have come back, I realized, oh, and it all clicked. And it was at the end of the whole sermon. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this chapter is about these different characters who they all kind of messed up, but most of them come back and go, I realize now what God wants me to do. And they go on to do great things.
Yeah.
Judas doesn't. And he goes on to kill himself. What'd you guys think about?
Yeah, I think that was a really clear thing that the Holy Spirit brought out on Sunday. What the theme of, like, you're not too far. You're not too far gone. You're there's not really anybody beyond. At the very least, God's desire to be reached. I know that, we might get into some topics later of like, well, predestination versus, whatever. But ultimately, what we can bank on is that God's desire is that none should perish. And God's desire for Judas was that he, even post betrayal, would have still returned to Jesus and sought forgiveness and redemption and reinstating, but ultimately that ball is left up, in our court. So I think that was what was really, really pretty insightful for me. It was like, wow, man, what an amazing God we serve, that even to the very end, like, he was providing opportunities for not just Judas, but each of his disciples that would ultimately fall to be forgiven and then to grow from it and be better. It was really, really pretty powerful.
Yeah. And before we get to Daniela and Tim, that question comes up all the time. I've heard it my whole life. Like, did Judas have a choice? Because obviously Judas had a role to play, and obviously he had to be part of this ending. So therefore he had no choice. Like, God destined him to be the worst. What did he say? No one uses my name anymore.
Oh, right.
I have a thought on that, but anyway, what do you think on that, Johnny?
So I can't pretend to obviously fit God in my brain. I have my ideas about it. Like, I do think, the Bible does say that he creates some for destruction. And Paul says, like, hey, dude, at the end of the day, you're the clay and he's the potter. Like, and you don't get to, like, have a problem with that, But we also see all over the Bible Jesus pursuing people and desiring that none should perish, and making ways for people to be redeemed and to come into relationship with them. So I think that is just a testimony to the authenticity of God's love, right? Because if God wasn't willing to be vulnerable with his heart, just because he knew, like, well, Judas is going to betray me, so I'm not even going to love him, right? right? If God acted like us in that way, where we create these coping mechanisms to protect ourselves from hurt, then God's love wouldn't be genuine towards us, right? So every single time he puts his heart out there, and the hope and the off chance that people, even somehow with his foreknowledge, foresight, omniscience, like that his creation would ultimately come into relationship with him because he loves us and he knows that that's the best for us.
Yeah. What do you,
Yeah, the line where
Tim,
that changes, like, I don't know.
Tim, what do you think on that?
Dude, just as you were recapping kind of what you were saying about Judas and what Charlie Brown went up there and was saying about Judas, dude, my heart was stirred on like who would relate to Judas right now in today's, where they like have already kind of like thrown in the towel of, God's already off the table for me. I've already messed up too bad. Like I'm kind of just giving up on that idea because like I don't think I could be forgiven in this way. And my heart just broke in this way of like how many more people say would return to Jesus or want this forgiveness or just forgive themselves if us Christians, right, or us Bible or Jesus followers would make that effort to like reach out to them or to know. And I don't know, even thinking, what if one of Jesus's disciples like hunted down Judas to like try to bring him back in, how that could have turned out different. But I don't know. I felt moved in this, like, dang, there are people who are that sunk or that like buried under their guilt that they just have kind of thrown in the towel and said like, well, God's just not an option for me. And I don't know, it really was just stirred my heart of like, we have to show them this love that we're like able to pull them out from under that guilt or that shame.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Daniela? What do you think about, did Judas have a choice when people throw that down, that gauntlet of, man, we don't have a choice? Judas is a great example. What do you say to that?
I think Judas had a choice. Imagine if Judas turned his life around after that betrayal and said, man, I messed up so bad. And as Charlie Brown was explaining, if there's one thing you learn from me is ask for forgiveness because you're not far away. Well, what if Judas had really like turned his life around and started preaching and started sharing the gospel and started saying, look, I am the worst of the worst. I betrayed Jesus and look where I am now. I'm preaching to the people. I'm preaching to generations. I'm going to share about the forgiveness that Jesus showed me even when I betrayed him. So imagine if like he were an example in the Bible. One thing that we were talking about in the sermon or that you mentioned is all of these disciples were bad people, tax collectors, sinners, or people that, you wouldn't look at them and you wouldn't be like, oh, he's a follower of God. But they all turned in some of the best books of the Bible, like you were mentioning. So what if we threw Judas in the mix and Judas said, I, the ultimate betrayer, was forgiven. This is my testimony.
Wow.
So I think I think he did have a choice. I also think that sometimes, like Tim's explaining, some people are so pushed to the bottom and feel like there's no way that I can be loved, be forgiven, be chosen, and feel like the only decision left is how Judas ended. So maybe that was his choice right there. But that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The concept that Judas didn't have a choice because it was said so many times, this is what Judas is going to do. I think about my own son and how many times with my son, I go, if you do this, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And what you're doing with this is leading to this. And I go, you are continuing to choose these things. And so this, and this is going to happen. Like, I'm putting it out there exactly what my son is going to do because of where he is in the moment. But I'm putting it out there so that he doesn't do it. And so I think I step back into Jesus is telling him, like, at the table, you know, you're going to do this. You need to have your eyes open for what's about to happen. He puts him in charge of the money. And just like that skit kind of played out, by the way, if you haven't seen the skit, it's in the full video available on my page or the church page. And then I will also pull the skit out separately, probably in the next couple of days, and let you see it. But it continues to have this imagery of, I was put in charge of the money. Why would Jesus do that? Well, Jesus continues to give Judas every opportunity to beat the enemy. And I think the same thing goes on in our life. Like, yeah, we have choice, and we can choose to do wrong things or right things. Here's the other part of it that we sometimes forget. God's outside of time.
Yeah.
And I think we are so linear, going, well, he was going to do this, and this. And we forget that we have a choice where we are, but God can also see the very end and see. So he kind of knows what we're going to do. He's still in the moment with us. And I think he's actually even sort of surprised, which I don't know if this is true. This is me talking. This is just a podcast. We don't know everything, but I almost think of it as presents. And Jesus has these presents. Well, you can open the present anytime you want, but you wait till Christmas morning. And so sometimes I think he enjoys a moment with us because he's waiting to experience it with us, even though he has very well the ability to just jump ahead and see what happens.
Right.
That's just me talking.
Judas was predestined. He was predestined to betray Jesus because Jesus knew it was going to happen. But Judas also had the choice post betrayal, you know?
Yeah, no confusion there whatsoever. I get it.
And so we all have consequences, good consequences, bad consequences for whatever decision we choose to make. It's your choice to make like the good one or the bad one, whether they're good or bad consequences. So it's Judas.
Judas being Judas. All right.
Judas.
So the other subject that we really didn't have time for is communion. I obviously talked about it, and we worked our way through the Seder, which is really a word for this is the order. Right. And I was thinking we should really discuss, but it was a full another sermon, how we're doing communion. There are times when we kind of just move through it quickly. There are times when I'm choking on this tiny piece of bread, and I'm like, this just doesn't feel quite right.
Tastes like chalk.
Yeah, it tastes like chalk. I'm like, this should be special, but I mean, we're also under constraints of time and getting this bread out to everyone. You know, we're doing a tiny little cup of juice, and I go, this doesn't feel right to me, because when I read about it, this is an all-day family and friends moment. But we still want to do it. We want to have it as part of the church. I don't know. What do you guys think about communion and just the whole process?
Yeah.
We're doing it all wrong.
We definitely have made it something I don't think it was ever meant to be. I mean, gosh, even if you just like filter in I don't know which gospel it says, but like, if you're doing this with sin in your heart, then you're drinking judgment upon yourselves. Like, you know, like God might just kill you where you stand to make an example out of you. Like, there's so much more to it. I think what really the part that we miss, right, is that Jesus could have asked for anything, you know, to be remembered by, you know, like kings before have, like, you know, build a big golden statue of me to remember me or whatever, Nebuchadnezzar, right? You know, Jesus obviously being more worthy than any earthly king in ever. And what he is asked to be remembered by and to remember him in is in a meal with people, right? in spending time in unity and with people, becoming one with people through shared time and shared meals. And like, that's not like, oh, this is all I have, so this is just what I'm going to pick. Like, that was intention from God. Like this, there's something pretty special that takes place when we spend time and share a meal with people, or at least should take place. So in our church services, like, I don't want to deconstruct everything, that Western churches become, but like, it has created different issues for like, well, we can't have like a 4-hour meal, at a church service, because that would just be, like different, not different, but like be a separate entity entirely. Which really is kind of the idea, is like, spend time remembering me in your relationship and unity and love for one another over a meal, right? Like, I am pleased and honored when the body comes together and reflects what I care about most, which is people and relationship.
Yeah.
And so the grape juice and the fake bread, like, it's probably useful for, at best, casting people's minds towards the cross and the victory of what it is. But and I hope we get into it, but there's just so much more, even if we just understood the actual Passover feast and then what Jesus fulfilled in each of it, that I'd say 90% of the church has no idea about on a Sunday, any given communion Sunday. So yeah, I think we have a real poor shadow of what God's heart for communion is. Is it useless? I wouldn't say that. But there's definitely room that we could, I think, in a lot of areas, try to get our community of believers back to a model that Jesus created.
Yeah, 100%. And it's kind of interesting because I've had people almost get mad that, we didn't take that moment even more seriously. And I'm thinking, oh, that's just touching the surface. We haven't even began to really do communion. That's just reminding you, and we're not going to take it away. So if you're a church member watching this, don't worry, it's not going anywhere. I just think we're not giving it its true like service. What do you guys think, Daniela?
And I hate to use this word, but we've had to modernize it, is what it is. First, it's the time constraints. And secondly, we can't really be serving actual wine, like
says who?
In the service, or we'd have to differentiate like who's of age, who's not of age, and whatnot. But, and then on top of that, I know that we respect this, but we've got like allergies. And so we have like gluten-free options and whatnot. And that's like helpful. But to me, communion is just something of reverence to the Lord. It's so like sanctified, at least for me, it's just a moment of holiness, of communication with the Lord, remembering what was done on the cross. And I think for me, what's most important is setting up my intentions during that process, even if it's a 5-minute moment where I'm setting up my intentions and speaking to the Lord one-on-one, saying, this is my remembrance of you. But I would have to say fully, and I agree that communion, what it is meant to be, is not what we are participating in today. It's a snippet of what we should be doing. But I also have to encourage and say that communion is a personal thing. It shouldn't be something that, oh, it's the first Sunday of the month, I got to get to church because I got to do my communion. Communion should be a thing among yourself, like within yourself, all the time. You should be in communion with the Lord. That's, we've been talking in Luke about prayer, and part of communion is having that prayer conversation with God. So what's stopping you from having communion with him all the time? It's having that relationship, that conversation with the Lord. So continually have it. Yeah.
Yeah, and in this particular book, it doesn't even say do this in remembrance of me. We know that comes over in Matthew. I don't have it on top of my head, but you know where it is. The point here was to really walk through the entire order.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, what are your thoughts? Like, how can we do this in our homes? It was even convicting for myself because I've gotten used to the way we do communion, and I didn't think much of it. I thought this is really special, and we're going to do it this Sunday, by the way, and it's going to be really special. But this chapter, I go, I have to take some moments throughout the year, invite people over, and really walk through each glass, what it represents, each dip. It's different parts of the plagues and stuff. It's just a really important part that we don't talk about enough. What do you think, Tim?
Well, I think what you just hinted at was the intentionality behind it, and the intentionality to, like, how often do you show up on a Sunday morning and it's like, oh yeah, okay, it's Communion Sunday today. Like, we're getting a cracker. But I do believe that obviously communion and the way we do it on a Sunday morning is so impactful, and it does really take that time to, like, whoa, okay, let's really put my focus on the importance of my unity with Christ. Because he says, like, partake of me, like, eat my flesh and drink my blood.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's like, okay, you are so unified and united with Christ. Just like we see in John chapter 17, where Jesus says a prayer for us. And I don't know that chapter gets preached enough, but that prayer, that chapter, John 17, Jesus is literally praying for his disciples and for future disciples, saying, my desire for you is to be one with me, just like I am one with the Father.
Yeah.
And then the definition, or the word communion, right? The definition of communion is not like, drinking cracker. The definition of communion is like this communication, this relationship, this time spent with one another. And obviously in our Western civilization, we're all so busy all the time, right? As soon as we work the 9 to 5 and we get home and we're exhausted, we don't have people over.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing I've really appreciated about our small groups that we've been able to do. The different small groups, because we spend time communing with one another, and we have a meal together, and we stop and we, I believe, do what it says right here in Acts chapter 2. The last portion of Acts chapter 2, I think, very well lays out what communion should look like, or would look like. I mean, obviously Sunday morning has its place of remembrance and repentance, and but I would like to read just this last part of Acts chapter 2. Right, Acts chapter 2, the Holy Spirit fell. 3,000 people were added to the church that day. They all were praising in tongues. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were taught and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all people.
Yeah.
And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. And I think being part of a church and running a church, like we do the Romans Road every Sunday after church, right? We want people to be saved. And I think we're going to see people being saved just by, loving one another and really enjoying each other's company, and doing so in this gladness and remembrance of Jesus. And people are going to want to be a part of that. And then they're going to come to be believers just by seeing how much fun we're having with each other and being followers of Christ ourselves.
Communion is community.
Yeah.
It's like, it's being part of our community, taking care of our community. Communion is not just limited to a cup and a piece of bread.
Right.
It's literally, Acts is just speaking of people coming together and acting in community, taking care of each other. Community tonight, the Harvest Festival, like, that's for our community. That's a way that we can share communion, honestly.
Yeah. I'm reading a couple books that come from the early Christian fathers, some of the more interesting characters that aren't in the Bible, like Barnabas and some of his writings. And anyway, they talk about hospitality so much. And it's fascinating because they don't talk about evangelism.
Right.
But when you talk about the early numbers, most of that came from a hospitality, a spirit of brotherhood and bringing people over and just being kind.
That's a good point.
And that's where people came to know the Lord. And one of the fastest times that the church spread, I can't wait. That's part of the Christmas series. But Anna said, imagine the apostles sitting around that table, and he says, this is my body broken for you. How they must have just been like, wait, what? And so it is true. And it happens the very next chapter. So he's just right in front of it. We're going to be talking about that part on Sunday. But they had to be going that I don't even know. I don't know what was on. They just had been blown away, which is why they immediately start talking about other things. It's kind of what we do is deflect, right?
Yeah.
At this point where whatever Jesus says, it may make no sense to me at all, but I'm just going to shake my head and say, okay, Lord, give me the faith. Show me how to live that out.
Yeah. And it all comes together very quickly after that. But yeah, those were some tough last days. Okay. So there was 3 things that got cut. I just didn't have time. 3 things on the cutting room floor. One was a real deep dive on Judas. The second was real deep dive on communion. And the third one, I almost made the whole message about this. The guys falling asleep while Jesus is praying and him being obvious to them, like, I need your prayer right now. Yeah. And then coming back and he's got blood, like he's sweating blood, saying, hey, stay awake. How in the world Jesus doesn't just go off the rails right there? Because that would be, I can't imagine even like my team around me. If I said I need prayer, guys, I came back and they were sleeping, I would blow my mind. Yeah. And Jesus, he's like, okay, well, the time has come. It's crazy to me how patient he was. Can you believe that?
No.
I'm super thankful that he is. That's for sure. It's such an interesting statement. It says that they were asleep from sorrow, right? Like in verse 45, when he found them sleeping from sorrow. And I'm wondering, like, so obviously he opens up that scene, if you will. They get to the garden. It says, pray that you may not enter into temptation. So he goes off and he's praying, and obviously he's praying that he would be empowered by the Holy Spirit to be obedient to what God has asked him, right? Jesus was perfectly obedient. He learned obedience by being obedient, but that didn't mean he didn't ask for the Holy Spirit. Like, I need to be ministered to. I need to be built up and encouraged. So he doesn't fall into the temptation of disobedience. But I'm wondering, like, what was going on with them a stone's throw back that they would fall asleep from sorrow? Like, I've felt anguish and sorrow before. I mean, I think maybe not anguish. That's a pretty incredibly intense word, but sorrow before. And I have felt this desire to escape it. I don't like the way I feel. So I'm wondering, I don't know if maybe they're starting to understand a little bit of, like, maybe Holy Spirit's revealing to them like what's coming, or like, what were they so sorrowful about that the only escape they had was sleep? Like, it didn't say they fell asleep from exhaustion. It says from sorrow. And the Bible doesn't mince words. So I think partly that's also why Jesus is able to be patient, because it says in the Psalms, King David says, like, you remember my frame and that we are dust. Like, he's acquainted with our, shortcomings. And so he's probably sensitive enough to be like, I get it, right? He says later, take heart. Like, I have overcome the world. Like, you're going through it. And I know this is probably really hard for you, but you need to be praying. You need to endure. Otherwise, like he said earlier, Simon, Simon, the devil wants to sift you. He's asked me for you that you would be sifted like wheat. And so I think that's partly how he's able to be patient, is because he's just recognizing our frailty and our weakness, and he has grace for that. But also, like what amount of spiritual warfare was happening over these men's life, right? The cornerstone, the foundation of our faith. In these crux moments, the enemy is scheming and setting against them stuff we've probably never even experienced, that kind of level of oppression and attack. And so I don't know. I feel like there's a lot more that the Bible's okay with us not knowing about in those moments. However many hours Jesus was praying, and then they fell asleep. They gave up. And
Yeah. I think you nailed it with the Simon Simon verse. That's the giveaway.
Mhm.
He understands the power of the enemy. He understands that we don't understand the enemy,
Right.
and just how big he is. And so I feel like that's been the part that people aren't putting those two verses together and going, oh, Jesus understands how much we don't know and how weak we are and how much we struggle, which is why he gives us so much grace.
Yeah.
And so we see verses like this and it makes us laugh. Like, these guys are sleeping and Jesus doesn't get nearly as mad as we would. Absolutely. And that Simon Simon verse is the one that reveals, because Jesus knows how much that we don't know.
Mhm.
I just love that. I love that. What about you guys? What do you think, Daniela, Tim?
Well, I kind of want to, like, when I read that portion, I just like look at it more from like the physical and like the human perspective of it. And so first off, you know that Jesus is sweating blood, and that is an actual
Medical thing.
like a medical thing. It's called, I looked it up, hematohydrosis. But basically, it occurs in individuals suffering from extreme levels of stress. So that being said, we know Jesus in his human form was experiencing stress. Like, he was super stressed. Then in verse 42, he prays for his final plea of, Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will be, but yours be done. So you know that Jesus is doing his no, Lord, I will do it. But if this is your will, then like, so be done, you know? And then,
Heavy.
so you like all of these verses and these explanations of what Jesus is going through, his human body must have been exhausted, and the disciples are going through this as well. So to fall asleep, it's understandable.
Natural.
I mean,
response, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus is fully disappointed and saying like, I need you guys to be a part of this. And our human reaction would definitely be like coming in hot and like, are you kidding me? Like, you can't stay awake. I'm sweating blood over here and you can't stay awake. But in truth, I think when you as a human are so exhausted and you know it is your final time, and like you're not gonna give, like you are at the end of the rope, I don't think anger is your response. I think your response as a human is just, I just need you guys to support me. Like, this is the end for me. And instead of being angry, instead of being like raging and so upset, I think Jesus' response was quite appropriate in saying like, I need your support right here with me, you guys. Like, I need you guys to stay awake. I need you guys to pray with me because I'm at the end here. And so wake on up.
You know, a thought I just had in the middle of this too was, okay, you just did the Simon Simon, right? The Simon Simon, and he says, but I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back to strengthen your brothers. Okay, then he still fell asleep, And pretty much as soon as he wakes up, he jumps up and cuts that guy's ear off. You know, so I'm wondering if maybe he wouldn't have cut his ears off if he stayed awake and was praying.
Mhm.
I don't know. That was just kind of a fun thought there. And really, we don't see Peter get much ramification for that. He kind of, you know, denies Jesus later and takes a little bit more heat for that later. But there wasn't really much heat on the cutting off his ear.
Yeah, he gets bailed out of that so fast by Jesus.
Yeah.
That's an interesting. I didn't have time to even go any further with this chapter, so you have to read the rest on your own. But when that happens, he immediately jumps up and stops anything from happening,
Mhm.
which is, I think, just interesting.
Well, and I didn't even notice. I never realized that it says when Jesus' followers saw that what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike them with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. I didn't even realize that they had even asked to use their swords. And obviously, Peter wasn't waiting for an answer. He jumped up and
Yeah. And the high priest, that's a big deal. So that's a whole nother sermon, but that one wasn't on my cutting room floor.
I just pictured John having the other sword. John was the one who had the sword and asked, "Hey, should we do something?" And Peter's the one who just like jumped up and chopped.
Yeah. It's fascinating. A fascinating set of events.
Yeah. There's one more thing with the Peter thing. We have time for it. So Jesus, he's predicting his denial, but he's also like trying to find out where, so in verse 32, Jesus, but I have prayed for you, talking about Peter, that your faith should not fail, and that when you have returned to me, strengthen the brethren, right? So it's almost like this recognition and affirmation, like you're about to head into some real like L's. You're gonna take a few L's right now, Peter. And then culminating in this moment that almost makes me cry every time I read it later in the chapter.
Okay.
When Peter is in the act of denying him, right? So he's within earshot of where Jesus is being vehemently beaten and accused and abused. And Peter's trying to like, no, it's not me. Like, just shut up. Like, stop. I'm trying to listen to what's going on. And then right after the third time, in verse 61, right as Peter was still speaking, he hears the rooster crow, and then Jesus and Peter lock eyes. Like Jesus turns around and like looks at him in that moment, and they connect. And I just imagine this moment where like this, so Peter has a realization, like, I just did everything you said I was going to do, everything I said I would never do. And it's not obviously like this look of I told you so, but like maybe that's the look of like, man, I still love you.
Mm.
And I'm still for you, and I still have a plan, because you're going to return, Peter, and you're going to be the rock on which this church is built, and the testimony of what he said about Jesus being the Christ. Like, there's so much for you, and in this moment, like, don't give up, right? And this so much I feel like is happening in the physical and in the spiritual. When this moment where they look at each other, and then Peter realizes what he's done, and he runs out and like weeps bitterly. Like, I mean, you can't even write it like a movie better than this. And it's just, to me, shows so much incredible love that Jesus has for his disciples, that even in their weakness, right? As the thing that comes to my mind, that his grip on us is tighter than our grip on him. Like, he is faithful when we're faithless. And even in that moment when Jesus, like, you know, in our minds, we think Jesus needed support, Jesus needed his bros, Jesus needed his squad. Like, really, he knew who he had around him.
Mm.
And Jesus, even in those moments, was still there for them, right? And so, I don't know, that's something we didn't get a chance to get into. And I just love that small single verse where they just, right in the worst moment of Peter's denial, Jesus and Peter connect. And then, whew.
Yeah. That's a good place to end, because it brings us full circle, because Peter has that moment, wept bitterly, and then goes on to do incredible things for God.
Yeah.
Judas could have had the same moment. I mean, Peter's is a denial of Christ. That's supposedly the worst sin in the Bible. So if you think Judas was worse than Peter in this moment, I don't know, because
Yeah.
denying Christ is like the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
So if Peter returns in this moment, Judas probably could have too. And wherever you are, if you're watching this, you think you're that bad, you're probably not as bad as these guys. And they went on to do incredible things for God. So don't ever think you're too far away. Turn to Jesus. Man, there's no better way. Anyway, we're going to talk about 23 next week. Thanks for being on here. Share the video with somebody. I think it's important subjects that we spend a little bit more time on. We're all heading outside to start setting up for the Harvest Festival tonight. So if you're watching live, we'll see you tonight from 5 to 8 here at Yosemite Lakes Community Church. But I want to just thank you for watching and being part of this. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. See ya.